Yeah, the thing that happened in '95, and it was in front of the courtyard downtown, or courthouse downtown, probably the most significant public event that has happened in terms of racial issues in Grants Pass, in the last generation anyway. And it happened during the time when what were kind of colloquially referred to as a skinhead group, northern Idaho, they kind of had a conclave there and had their own little retreat thing, and it was, you know, neo-Nazi kind of thing, campground, militia, you know, kind of had that whole milieu wrapped together in it. And they really took root up there in northern Idaho. And I think because they knew some of the history, the Sundowner laws, and some of the things that were connected to Grants Pass's history, that they kind of thought they would have a fairly welcome reception, or at least they would have a significant number of people that maybe would kind of go along and hear their message. And so they had scheduled to come down and do some sort of public event. And in a real interesting application of that whole NIMBY, not in my backyard concept, basically the entire community in terms of the leadership representation. So you had political people, you had business people, you had social conscious people, nonprofit leaders. I mean, it was just across the board, just came together and said, no, they're not welcome. And basically put on a counter event that shut down the one that was originally planned, and it never happened. And the guys from Idaho came down and said, well, I guess we're not welcome here, and went back. And I think that was a really strong statement. I mean, it was a huge time to be proud of your community for what they were doing, you know, to acknowledge that history hadn't always been what it should have been in terms of race relations, but that was not what we believed now, and was not who we were going to be in the future. And somebody that was trying to resurrect the mistakes of the past in some new, you know, packaged form, just were not going to be welcome here. And like I say, quite literally, everybody just kind of rose up and said, no, not here. And so I don't know whether they actually got into town and saw that and left, or whether they just heard about it and decided not to come. But the net effect of it was that the kind of racist rally thing that was planned just never happened. I just think it was a really proud moment. Yeah, so I've been a part of a couple of men's groups, and our basic MO was to pick a book, and you know, sometimes we'd read the whole thing in a month, and we met monthly for breakfast and we would talk about it. Sometimes we'd go a little bit slower. And we picked a book on racial issues, Color of Compromise, and it was to try to help us get some historic background, because none of us grew up in inner city multiracial kind of communities. We grew up in kind of white homogenous communities. That was our background. I mean, we didn't pick it. You know, we weren't mad at anybody. It's just where our parents lived and we were born, you know. So there we were, but it didn't give us a lot of background. And so we wanted to try to educate ourselves a little bit. And the thing that was really telling for me was that the book opens up with a historical description of what happened in Richmond, California. And my first assignment outside of college was a few miles from Richmond. And I was impressed at the time, again, having grown up in kind of a white homogenous community, to see the segregation that happened. I was coming to this, you know, more urban kind of area, and just kind of anticipated that it was just going to be this mix of people all over. And what I found is that these kind of people lived here, and these kind of people lived here, and these kind of people lived here. And I was kind of going, why do they choose to do that? You know, so in my mind, it was a choice, because there were houses for sale everywhere. So why not go live over there, or go over there, or, you know, what was the deal? And so this book began to tell the story, and it goes back to World War II, when the shipyards cranked up because of the war effort. And people from all over the country were coming to California to work in the shipyards, and Richmond was one of those big ones. And so all these people came, and the book described how, you know, there were white people, there were black people, there were all kinds of different groups that came, but the people that were running the shipyards, the private contractors working on behalf of the government that were running the shipyards, segregated their workers. And so they had housing for all of the black laborers who'd showed up for the World War II effort, and they all lived over here, and the white people all lived over here. And then what happened after that, pretty typical, a lot of those people had come from pretty rural areas. I mean, you know, they didn't have running water. They didn't have plumbing. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that, but you know, most people in the 30s had outhouses in America. You know, and these people were coming from these rural areas going, wow, we're going to build new cities, and that's way better than going back. So everybody kind of wanted to stay, and the oil refineries moved in, and there was employment, and so there was this economic boom. But the banks had rules about where they would loan money in terms of geographic areas. If you were a black person, you wanted to buy a house over here, they would give you a home loan, but not if you were a black person and wanted to live over here. They wouldn't give you a home loan over there. And so they had these kind of, you know, lender zoning rules and regulations. And so they just continued to segregate the community. So by the time I show up, a generation and a half, 2 generations later, I'm just looking around going, why don't these people all live together? Why are they all over here and over here? And you begin to find out there were historic reasons. And I think obviously after a couple of generations of that and fears and anxieties and a desire to feel safe and a desire to feel like you fit, I think socially they begin to choose to live together when the banks were no longer restricting their, you know, that was now against the law. They couldn't, so they could have bought a home anywhere, but this is kind of where we've lived for the last couple of generations, and our relatives are close, and everybody here kind of understands me, and I'm okay. So I think what used to be done, because it was legally restricted in some ways, civil rights rules came in and reforms came in, and those things went away, and now it was social kinds of restrictions that were holding these people together in these kind of groups. But it was just interesting to hear that we didn't get there by accident. That segregation that I was seeing generations later was a segregation that had started as a very deliberate act of prejudice. And we were now living with that and living with that on both sides. I mean, I think some of the people in the black communities around the city of Richmond were kind of afraid to move out, weren't sure if they'd be accepted, didn't want to take the chance. So it wasn't that they couldn't. They had well-paying jobs, you know, they could get a bank loan, they could sell the house they had. But the other part of it was their houses had not appreciated in value as much because it was seen as a lesser community and a less desirable community. So they weren't likely to sell their house to a white family. It was going to have to be another black family, and the houses were, you know, so they were going to have to jump in terms of home loans and prices and all of that to make the move. They could, but so you just had these lingering financial restrictions that were not law, they just existed. You had these social things, they weren't law, but they existed. And it all started because somebody had deliberately tried to create a prejudicial segregation. And so it was just interesting to hear, okay, there's a reason why we got to where we are. And you know, there are probably going to have to be some specific steps to try to maybe undo those things. Well, I just think it was insightful for all of us, because like I said, none of us grew up in prejudicial families. One of the guys in the group had a couple relatives that were pretty prejudicial. And even before he knew anyone of a minority race, he didn't like his relatives because he didn't like their attitude. So it wasn't that anybody in the group was being transformed from this racially prejudiced person to this person who wasn't. It was, here's a bunch of information about how racial prejudice has affected our communities and our fellow human beings that we just weren't aware of because it was never part of our reality. So it was more that informative thing, which I think began to generate more an issue of sympathy out of all of that. For me personally, it led to talking to a black woman in our community that I'd become quite close to. And there was never any sense of hesitation between us. I mean, we got along fine, but what it did was it opened my eyes to the fact that she probably has a different mental, emotional history about life than what I do, even though at the point where we met, those issues were not a reality for the two of us. And so I just sat down with her and I said, you know, tell me about some things. And so she just began to share about, you know, incidences where people would be, you know, rude to her in public. And she wasn't assuming that it was because she was black, and they would mutter things and would say things and take little shots at her. And I'm going, what, that doesn't usually happen. In fact, I'm probably the one grumbling at Walmart going, get your kids under control and don't wear your pajamas in public. I'd be the one to be mumbling and grumbling under my breath in public places. I hadn't had people mumbling back to me, and certainly not because of something I couldn't do anything about. It'd be different if I was behaving badly and somebody called me on it, but to just, you have more melanin in your skin than I do, so I'm going to, bump into your cart and tell you to get out of town. That she still had to deal with some of that. And she's this joyous, successful person. I mean, she's wonderful to be around, but she has to compensate for that to be the wonderful person that she is, and that's just not part of my reality. And so to become sympathetic to that, and then to hear silly things that I would have never thought of, like, going to Fred Meyer and they've got this huge row of all of this, shampoo and hair conditioner and this and that and the other, and she's going, I can't find anything for my kind of hair. They don't sell that here, luckily, right? Google, we can get it online, right? But so in some ways it's a silly thing, but in another way, it's that kind of reminder. I think maybe that some of us feel when we travel and all of a sudden we're staring at things and we're trying to do currency conversions in our head and we're trying to read labels in French or Spanish that we can't really read, and we're guessing at the words, and we kind of feel uncomfortable and we kind of want to go home. For her, there's no home to go to. She has to face those kinds of issues all the time, and just kind of become comfortable feeling at times almost like she's living out of culture. And so it led to those kinds of conversations and experiences where we begin to discover, what's this other person's story? And yeah, I had a friend of mine that when we were talking about cultural issues, and the phrase was not unique with him, he was quoting someone else. But he said, the thing that kills us culturally is a hardening of the categories. Obviously a play on words. And I've seen the reality of that when I turn you into a them, you're not an us, you're a them. First of all, that allows me to demean you, not treat you with the same respect that I would treat an us because you're a them. But then when I harden those categories, and not only are you a them, but they're a them and they're a them, and that person over there is a them, and all of the thems are like that. That when we get hardening to the categories, it kills us culturally. And I think some of these conversations, reading the book and talking with my friend, help to kind of see how some of those categories can kind of just get built into the system. It's kind of the way you live, and you're not even necessarily conscious of it. And it's not even because you're necessarily prejudicial. You just have these thoughts because they're out there and there's no counter thought to challenge that. And so this was kind of some of that counter thought to help loosen up the hardening of the categories and begin to go, oh, let's give merit to each person on their own merit. I mean, I think that was kind of the Martin Luther King thing was, let's don't start with skin color. Let's start with skill, talent, ability, integrity. Let's start there, and then by the time we answer all those questions, we don't really care what color you are anymore. But that's harder to get to than it is to say. Here we are, 2 generations later, or at least a good solid generation later, and still struggling with it. Probably 2 things. The first would be coming from my Christian orientation and my high value of Scripture. It is always phenomenal to me how someone who says they are a follower of Jesus and who reads the book could ever accept prejudice, because the book just doesn't allow for that. It's so specific, because Paul mentions the gender issue, male, female, talks about social issue, those who are wealthy and those who are slaves, and then he talks about racial issues, and he specifically lists some of the racial categories of his day, and he's saying that doesn't exist in the God view of humanity. So it's always disturbing to me when people would would try to affiliate with being a follower of Christ and would try to point back to the book as being a rule for life, and can somehow let prejudice sit inside that category. It just makes no sense to me. That's always a frustrating thing. And I think the other thing that's frustrating is that this is such a complex issue, and we keep trying to simplify it in ways that seem to make it worse. It seems to be the nature of our culture, and maybe because we're kind of a two-party system. We get Democrats and Republicans, and very few independents ever get elected to anything. It's always a Republican or a Democrat. And so then all of our news shows are based on that. We have a moderator, and we have somebody from the left and somebody from the right. You know, we have a Republican and a Democrat. We have whatever. And those two people argue with each other, and the guy in the middle tries to get them to behave, and then they go to commercial. And we kind of try to turn every issue into this thing with a moderator in the middle and this person arguing and speaking over top of this person and back and forth. That we try to do that. And unfortunately, what I think that does when it comes to a lot of these racial issues is that it tends to, I think, actually ingrain the problem rather than find an answer to it. And so at the risk of you know, speaking in ways that people say are out of turn, because I'm not a black person, I can't speak to a black experience. But I've had some experience in communication with that, and both of our sons worked in a Christian-based ministry outreach in Southeast Washington, D.C. So it was on Pennsylvania Avenue, but it was on the other side of the Anacostia River. So if you're on this side, if you're on the west side of the Anacostia River, that's you eventually end up at the White House, and all the stuff are on Pennsylvania Avenue. If you go across the Anacostia River on Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's like, it was at the time 97, 98% black. So highly homogenous black community, separated and segregated because, I mean, the Civil War was literally fought right on that boundary, right? I mean, Washington, D.C. is right here. You go across the river, you're in Virginia, and that's a pro-slave Confederacy state. I mean, you know, so they were in the center of all of that, and a lot of black slaves that tried to, you know, get free from the South during the war came to Washington, D.C. and never left. As families, and so there's just a lot of history there, and it's really ingrained. And I know that community is changing now. I want to acknowledge that before somebody reads this and goes, "Oh, that's not the way it is now." There's been a lot of gentrification stuff that has happened, and so that community is changing. But it used to be a stark thing. I mean, on one side of the bridge it was this way, and on the other side of the bridge it was this way, and they were there. And you know, I have to say that I met black people who didn't understand my story either. Because I spent quite a bit of time there before I spoke, and I just worked in this house. It was a house for reconciliation. And so, I mean, there were gang fights out in the streets, and, you know, guns going off, and I mean, it's all kinds of crazy stuff. It was a wild neighborhood, and they were trying to find answers, and they were trying to, you know, curb violence and help people and do all the things that they could do. And they served a lot of meals, and they were bringing kids in after school to try to help with education. So there was a lot of good stuff going on, just good humanitarian things. And so I was there working, like I say, both of my sons spent time there. And, I just worked in the kitchen with the black ladies that were preparing the food all the time. I figured that was a safe place, and as long as I did what they told me to do, which they loved telling me what to do and then laughing at how poorly I did it, but you know, I could work in the kitchen for a while, but eventually became at least a safe person. You know, maybe not a trusted person, but at least a safe person. And so we began to talk, and I discovered for them that when they thought of poverty was always a black-white issue. White people had money, black people didn't. And in the dictionary version of the word prejudice, they were very prejudiced in their opinion. Now, they got there logically, and I can understand all the rest of that, but they were very locked into a black-white thinking, which is prejudicial thinking. Instead of human thinking, it was black-white thinking, hardening of the categories. And so I said, I just need to tell you that I live in a relatively poor community. We have the lowest per capita income rate of any county in the state of Oregon, partly because we've got a lot of old people living on no income. They're pulling off their savings. I get that. So I get that the numbers are a little bit skewed, but for sake of argument, I was able to tell them I live in this community. We have the lowest per capita income of any county in the state of Oregon. We have a significant number of people on poverty. I mean, to the point where we just made the free meal thing at school for everybody, because there were, 75% of the kids qualified, so let's just feed them all. Yeah, I mean, we just gave up. We'll just feed them all. I said, but here's the difference. For you, poor people are black and they live in urban high-rises built by the government and run by, kind of slumlord landlords, kind of, that's your understanding of poverty. I said, for me, all the poor people are white and they all live out in the country in, mobile homes with lean-tos on them. And they couldn't comprehend of poor white people. If I could say they were black, they could have maybe gone there, but to say they were as locked into their categories, they were as locked into their historical stories as I had been locked into my historical stories, and both of us had to it was, I mean, you could see it. They'd be comfortable. They're kind of squirming around in their chair. They're trying to make sense out of what I'm telling them because they just had no frame of reference for it. It was a whole new thought. It was a whole new, we didn't know about that any more than I knew their stories. And I'd begun to try to hear their stories and learn. And so I was 10 feet down the road farther than they were at that point. But they struggled with that. And I think it continues as you get into the broader discussions. There were, the whole issue, and, for good or for bad, but, Whoopi Goldberg has this platform, and so she makes statements and she gets heard and she posts things and has followers and all the rest of it. And her inability to understand that Aryan versus Jew was prejudice. Well, it can't be prejudice because they're both white. I mean, that's her premise. It's like, she's so locked into her story, that hardening of the categories again, she's so locked into her story that prejudice is only when a white person does something bad to a black person. It's not when two white people do things bad to each other because they see differences that maybe other people don't see. And so I think because prejudice is such a big thing and it's so complicated and it is so informed by your individual history and story that when we start to work on it, we boil it back down to the two talking heads and then we pick a side. And so I'm either for the one that wants, reparation payments and I want all of this stuff, or I'm a person that doesn't like black people and I just wish they weren't around. We actually make it worse by not acknowledging that it's complex, not acknowledging that everybody struggles with this issue, and let's figure out how to go back to being human instead of being in these subgroups of humans and then fighting with each other. It's just a complicated issue, and most people aren't willing to work that hard. They want a simple answer to a simple problem. Okay, tell me, I'll go do those two things and now I'm no longer prejudiced and I'm done. As opposed to, this is a complicated issue and we all have to work on it. And just because somebody was negatively prejudiced against you doesn't mean that you haven't been negatively prejudiced against somebody else. And you're just as wrong as that guy, but you like the feel of when you're doing it to someone. You don't like the feel of when someone's doing it to you. Wait a minute, let's all own up to our stuff and apologize for what we did wrong, as opposed to, again, I think we simplify, and when we do that, I think we actually make it worse.